My name is Andrew Schragger. I'm an attorney. I practice law here in the state of New Jersey. I've been an attorney for nearly 30 years. Well, the First Amendment protects us from government intervention in speech. It's a misconception of most people that the First Amendment protects all speech, um, but it really doesn't. It protects us, the citizens, from having our speech regulated by government and by the government or by government entities. So people complain about, you're violating my First Amendment rights, my freedom of speech, when an employer says you can't say this or you can't post this on your website or your Facebook page or Instagram. Unfortunately, that's not a First Amendment violation if an employer does that. And so it's a misconception, as I said, that the First Amendment protects all speech. It really doesn't protect all speech. And then there are also 3 or 4 categories of speech that it doesn't protect as well. There is the speech, the hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. That has been defined. Speech that causes undue alarm or harm. When it comes to, by way of example, the most popular example is if you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater if there is no fire, and cause a panic. And so that's the First Amendment in a nutshell. I mean, there's, when it comes to speech. Fortunately, no, there are no limits in what journalists can say or can't say. And you've seen that play out over the last few years, especially on cable news and Facebook posts. People can say whatever they want. And the problem is that if you couch it in terms of some sort of context or not give an entire context, then it can be believable. And that's kind of where we've gone now, is most of the news that we're getting is more opinion than it is actual news, actual facts. And it's understandable why individuals, citizens, don't trust the news or trust the information they're getting, because it's couched in opinion and perspective of who's providing the information and what their motivation is, if they have any, what their perspective is, what their personal preferences are. And that's detrimental to our democracy. I mean, that really is. That's where we're headed, and that's, unfortunately, I'm not sure how we come back to journalistic integrity when it comes to trying to be neutral and just giving the facts to people. That's a hard place to get back to, I think, in the current environment. Well, the big concept of censorship is that it goes along with the First Amendment. Okay, the First Amendment says you can say what you want, and the government can't prevent you from saying things, except for those limited categories. And that's the concept of censorship. If the government is saying you can't say something, that's censorship. But the word censorship has been used is used so broadly that, you know, it applies and can be things like we've seen lately, where school boards are banning books. Well, that's a form of censorship. That certain ideas, certain concepts cannot be taught in schools. That's a form of censorship. Certain things cannot be broadcast on certain kinds of television networks. That's a form of censorship. But the biggest concept, the biggest concept with censorship goes back to the First Amendment, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the government regulating the speech. the government saying what can and can't be said. And that's the illegal censorship or the improper censorship. It's not illegal for a private citizen to say, I don't want my children to read something. That's not censorship. I don't want to buy this magazine or book because it has ideas that I don't agree with. That's not censorship. It's usually an organization, a government entity that's saying, again, using the First Amendment to say this can't be said or should not be said or should be changed. And that's how the word censorship and the First Amendment kind of are kind of the same in many respects. They interact together. They're similar terms. We see censorship sometimes on television because there are certain rules that there are the over-the-air television networks like ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, and some of the independent television stations which are considered over-the-air. Even though you get them through cable, you could disconnect your cable or your internet connection and still get them with an antenna. Most people under the age of 40 don't know what an antenna looks like on their television, the rabbit ears kind of thing. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of that or seen that, but you can get it over the air, and those networks are regulated differently than your regular cable networks because the airwaves are considered owned by the people or the government of the United States, and therefore the government has a authority to regulate those airwaves, and there's something called the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates what can go out over the air. And the concept is to protect children, but it may be a form of censorship to some people. But we don't get into that much anymore because everyone has access to cable news and cable Netflix and Instagram and Facebook. So the big four that they used to refer to them as don't have as much influence. I mean, the news networks on ABC, CBS, NBC. I mean, it's a half-hour news every night, and it's really not much of substance there. Certainly that you can't get into deep. So we don't worry about. I don't think most of the citizens, at least from my perspective, worry about the concept of censorship because we're not worried about the government telling us, at least the big government. I mean, the federal government or the state government. Now, that changes when you get down to the local level, especially on the school board level. And that's where the fight is going on now with regard to censorship in the First Amendment. And you've probably seen a lot of articles, especially in the more red states where there are school boards saying that we can't teach certain things. This is happening in Florida a lot, where they stop teaching AP courses. I think psychology was one of them, and Black history or something like that is not being taught anymore. School districts around the country, especially in the red states, are banning certain books. That's a form of censorship. That's plain and simple. It's censorship. It's not letting ideas out there that may conflict with your own, and that's scary. That's problematic, and that really goes to the heart of how this country was founded and why this country exists the way it has existed for as long as it has. The First Amendment is the First Amendment, and it's the first one for a reason. It was the most important one to the founders and the drafters of the Constitution. It was important to have the right to speak out against the government or speak out in a manner you felt appropriately, because the King of England was preventing people from speaking. And most of speech back then was in printed publications, pamphlets. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin used to print pamphlets, and And if you look back at history, a lot of them did it anonymously, and the king was upset about these things. So it became the First Amendment because it was the most important thing for our founding. I hate to use the word fathers because there were mothers there involved too. Our founders of this country felt it was the most important aspect, and why one of the major reasons why we broke from the King of England. Our predecessors broke from the King of England. Everyone thinks it was this taxation without representation. That's part of it, but most of it was, hey, you're not letting us talk the way we want to talk, and pray the way we want to pray, and gather the way we want to gather. And that goes to the heart of the First Amendment. There's a lot, but not when it comes to the First Amendment or this concept of speech. I wish more people understood that the First Amendment and what its history and why it was created and what it actually prevents. Because you have people who, you could talk about politicians and Donald Trump and others claiming all of this fake news, and that violates my First Amendment. It's just a First Amendment violation. It's not, because a news organization, is not involved in the First Amendment. It can say what it wants. So I wish people knew more about what the First Amendment actually protects and actually governs when it comes to speech and news media and your right to speak at a school, your right to speak at your job, things like that, and where your speech can be limited or restricted. And I think most people in this country don't realize that. They think the First Amendment applies across the board to everyone. I can speak whatever I want, wherever I want, whenever I want, however I want. Not so true. When it comes to cable news and the internet and things like that, unfortunately, the government and a lot of organizations in this country have been fighting for a number of years to try to figure out how to regulate speech on that. And there's been proposals in the U.S. Congress for years in various ways to try to regulate content, and they've all failed, or most of them have all failed. They get minimum stuff, but there have been some Electronic Communications Acts versions that have attempted to rein in this concept of fake news or ghost accounts or fake Facebook postings or things like that. But most of these accounts and most of these postings seem to favor one side or the other. So one side or the other doesn't want them to go away. One side actually likes them. Europe is more progressive when it comes to regulating content. But most European countries don't have a First Amendment, a constitutional First Amendment that governs their activities. Most countries don't have a concept in a constitutional like document as like the First Amendment. Now, a lot of the democratic countries have a statute or regulation regarding freedom of speech, but that can be modified and amended relatively easy with the majority in most countries. In this country, it's much harder to amend the First Amendment and change it because you need 2/3 of the states to amend the Constitution, and therefore it becomes a very difficult process. So that's kind of what I wish most people would understand. Stop bantering the First Amendment around when it's not relevant, especially the politicians.